I'm going to turn the program over to Josh Cohen, who is on the litigation section board, and he'll take it away. Josh.
Thank you, Anne. So good afternoon, everyone. Quick plug, we're co-sponsoring programs in February and March with the ADR section, and I hope you will consider doing that. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Matthew Cahill from Percipio company. Matthew and I were in a networking group together, and I've seen his presentation regarding bias. That is what he specializes in, and really looking forward to hearing from him and his co-panelists about bias, and particularly focused on the legal field. So without further ado, Mr. Cahill.
Thank you, Josh. I really appreciate you extending the invitation to myself and my trusted advisors and colleagues, Randy and Sejal. For these sessions, all of you have been Zooming for the last 10, 11 months, or however long it's been. We are all losing track of time. We're all trying to make do with what we can. And hopefully all of you are focusing on the silver linings that this brave new world that we find ourselves still in, and really making every effort to connect with people. And that's what we've designed for you today. So this isn't going to be your traditional CLE course or credit with one person talking for the majority of the time. It will be some of that, but what we like to do and what really helps me help you understand what bias is, the approach that we're taking with it, and how it applies to attorneys. It's really difficult when you don't see faces in the room. And so this is set up so that we have mechanisms to receive some of your feedback. So the Q&A, please make liberal use of that if you have a question at any point when I'm speaking, or Sejal or Randy, and the chat. We need your input so we know that you're not, maybe you are off getting a sandwich while you're listening, but maybe you can sit down with the sandwich and then type in something at some point. Whatever that might be, we're going to try to give you some prompts so that the 15 attendees have an opportunity to have their voice be heard in the context of this session. So I'm going to do what I like to refer to as hijacking your screen. So right now it's primarily just me on the screen. And what I'm going to do is move my face out of the way and take over your screen real estate with some content. The California Lawyers Association defines this as a elimination of bias credit or course. And I have issue with that. I think eliminating bias is impossible. So that's the tweak that I put onto the title of this course. And to set out to prove that, I want to get some evidence. And most of you, I believe, received a link prior to this session that gave you an opportunity to take a bias assessment. And after doing that, assuming if you did or even if you didn't, I want you to just address the question that's on the screen right now. So to do that in Zoom, you just click on chat, you can pop it up, and you can send it to attendees, panelists, or everyone, and give me some feedback on what is bias. I like to do this at the beginning of a session so that I can tailor and really modify what I'm doing to meet you where you're at. So if you can just put into the chat right now, what is bias? What is your working definition for what is bias? What comes top of mind when you hear the term bias? And I'll just kind of give voice to what you're putting in there. Beautiful, Pam. Thank you. Pam is putting in there a preconceived belief. Darian is saying preconceived notions about things or how they should be. Excellent. Thank you, Darian. Shanti is saying unconscious prejudice. Yes. Now we're getting juicy. Now we're getting into some meat of the conversations. Preconception about what somebody is about is what Joshua added to this conversation. prejudice or belief about something, presumptions, assumptions. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you, Christopher. Preconceived ideas about characteristics. Yes, yes, yes. Unconscious response to social situation. Beautiful, Kevin. Thank you. And Adam is putting in there being affected by stereotypes. Love, love, love this. All of these are giving us a collective definition and understanding about what bias is. And what I want to, sort of move to a later part of this session is bias related to what I collectively call social biases. And social biases, while this isn't a comprehensive list, there are 4 social biases that I call the titans that impact every law firm, every industry, every workplace, and society at large. And those social biases are gender bias, racial bias, cultural bias, and age bias. Now, I name these 4 when I start to refine and scope out a conversation about bias in the workplace. And when you start to have these conversations, something happens inside of the brains of most people. They're either going to get defensive, or perhaps they're going to get a little excited about what's going on, right? Bias is a very useful construct, believe it or not, to have more in-depth conversations about what's happening in your mind and in the workplace. And so these 4, before we're going to unpack these 4 biases, these 4 social biases as they relate to specifically the practice of law, I want to give you some other conceptual framework to deepen your understanding about what bias is and why I don't think it's possible to eliminate it. Because bias comes in many different forms. There's conscious bias, right? Which you can see here, an intentional act in favor of or against a person, place, or thing, right? Usually it's considered to be unfair or unjustified. And then there's this whole area of unconscious bias. And unconscious bias is, no doubt you've heard that term at some point before, but it's building off of tremendous advances that we've had in the fields of neuroscience and social psychology, evolutionary biology. We're learning more and more and more about how our brains process information. And if you have a brain, which I'm assuming most of you do, you have bias. It's really that simple. And when you frame it that way, it starts to become a little more fascinating. Who doesn't want to learn a little bit more about how their brain works? And one of the leading areas of research is applying an information processing model to how our brain is processing information. And in our modern world, we are processing about 11 million bits of information every second. 11 million bits of information is being processed by that gray matter between our ears every second. And most of that 11 million bit process of information, bits of information, is being processed unconsciously. It's outside of our conscious awareness. According to the same model and the same research, we can only process about 50 bits of information in our conscious areas of our brain. Now, let those numbers sink in a little bit. That's a huge discrepancy. 99.995% of how we process information is rooted in these unconscious areas of our brain. This is where the unconscious biases become incredibly fascinating, because those are what shape our perceptions. Those are the birthplace of stereotypes. Those are collective experience in life help shape how we then experience people in real time as soon as we meet them. So when you think about how our brain is processing information, some of the best work on this that further elaborates on these two different areas of processing is done by Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics. He was actually a psychologist by trade, but he partnered up with a guy named Amos Tversky, and they did a lot of work that really shed a lot of light on that 11 million bit area of cognitive processing. And he called it very simply System 1. That 11 million bit area is System 1. He didn't really get creative with his titles, but System 1 has distinct characteristics. So that 11 million bit unconscious processing is very fast. It's automatic. It's how we make mental associations. It's how we make everyday decisions. It's how we, end up having flavors of things, and how we end up having prejudices for things, and how we have the automatic associations that we make when we meet somebody who's different than us. All of those things are rooted in that 11 million bit area of processing that Kahneman calls System 1. Then there's also this thing called System 2, which is that 50-bit area of conscious processing, right? That's where you're exerting mental energy to stay focused. This takes a lot more time. This requires a lot more effort. And this is where you're doing all of your complex reasoning, right? When you're writing a brief, or you're preparing for a case, or you're, just reading, right? That requires this cognitive effort of awareness. And if you do any of that for any length of time, all of you know how tiring that is, how exhausting that is, how mentally drained you can become, because that takes a lot more effort, right? But when you exercise System 2 in that 50-bit area, your processing, your decisions become more reliable. You're less prone to making mistakes. I see that the audio went out for a moment. Josh, can you just confirm you're hearing me okay now? Beautiful, beautiful. So I mentioned a lot of advances in research, in technology, in neuroscience, in so there are over one, that area is fascinating. Rather than go through all 180 of them and how they apply to you, I'm going to go through 5 that I think are the most relevant for the practice of law. And those 5 are called, they fall into an acronym called LEAP. Like me, egocentric, availability, anchoring, and proximity. And those 5 cognitive biases are 5 of the 180. They're 5 that are the most common, and they're 5 that are being utilized and exploited in some cases inside of that 11 million bit area of unconscious processing. They're happening all the time. And I'm presenting them as distinct and separate, but they're not mutually exclusive. The same way that social biases are presented as separate, but they're not mutually exclusive. There's intersections within each of those social biases. But social biases are best understood and measured in behaviors, right? Cognitive biases have everything to do with thought. Social biases best measured in behaviors, and it's those behaviors over time that result in institutionalized biases, right? So we can trace one example all the way through: cognitive biases of like me. So if you have a firm that's just all white men, they look like me, right? Their cognitive biases, because of like me bias, they're going to be attracted to other people like them, right? So that's the behavior over time. They end up hiring people only like them. That practice then becomes institutionalized, right? We're doing a lot today to disrupt that bias ecosystem. And that's what we're going to get into a little bit more when I pass the screen stage over to Sejal, who's going to talk a little bit more about social biases. Now, before we do, I want to recap. Those of you that did take the bias assessment prior to today, Would you be so kind as to put into the chat, which of the cognitive biases did you score the highest on? Which of the 5 did you score the highest on? If you don't remember, if you don't have your results in front of you, that's no big deal. But if you could just put into the chat, if you did take it, which one did you? Ah, beautiful. Thank you, Shanti. Like me bias. That's very, very common. Very, very common. Like me bias. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Anyone else take that? Pam also scored pretty high on like me. Excellent, excellent. Like me is the easiest one to get your mind wrapped around. We're all subject to it. This is why what I meant when I said, if you have a brain, you have bias, because like me bias, it stems from a survival heuristic. Because when you meet people, sometimes it's a conscious process. More often it's an unconscious process. There's a danger threat matrix happening inside of your amygdala. And if you are attracted to that person, if you're comfortable with that person, then you're more likely to engage with that person, right? And so that has a lot to do with that unconscious mental process called the like me bias. Anchoring bias, egocentric bias. Thank you, Rand. Thank you, Darian. I'm going to unpack each of those briefly, but I want to reiterate before I go off this slide, the scores that you received do not in any way indicate that you are a bad person, but rather that you are perfectly human. We all have these biases inside of our brain, these cognitive biases, and what they create are blind spots in our thinking. And that's why it's so important to surround ourselves with people and arm them with this language so that you can really be able to disrupt the biases that exist in our ecosystem. So very common, somebody was asking in the chat, what is anchoring? Anchoring bias is decisions that are based on that first data point and graph or image. Now, of these 5, when I do these with groups of attorneys, egocentric bias is usually pretty high. We had at least one person who scored highest in egocentric bias because that cognitive process really helped you pass the bar exam. It helped you achieve a certain measure of success in your career. Doctors, lawyers, anybody that's a subject matter expert is most susceptible to egocentric bias. Why is that? Because we forget that not everybody has that same level of experience that we do. So you need to be very mindful of what egocentric bias is and how it can impact your work life especially, right? So the indicators there are when you just say something and you assume that everybody just knows exactly what you mean, right? Seems like a silly thing to do. And most of the time, if you're focused in that cognitive system 2 area, 50-bit area, you forget, right? That not everybody has had your experience. So egocentric bias is really about building in practices so that you're going to be a more thorough, right, litigator. You're going to be a more thorough researcher, right? A more thorough writer. Like me bias, we discussed that. Availability bias is one that we use all the time, and it's exploited by our media. Availability bias is the power behind the redundancy of advertising. And so whatever goes into our brain swims around in there for a while, and it's the first available. And so therefore we give that more weight than we do all of the other research and information that's available about a given topic. Proximity bias, that is one where it's taken a real strong turn in this pandemic that we find ourselves in. So I won't elaborate too far on proximity bias other than to say the world that we live in right now, the illusion of proximity. What we're doing right now with my face and screen so close to you and your screen is better and more productive than if we were actually in this close proximity. And yet our mental process, our normalcy bias has us yearning to be back in this kind of physical proximity with people, but it's just not safe, right? The numbers bear out. We can't succumb to that unconscious normalcy bias and put ourselves in harm's way by overvaluing being in close proximity with each other right now. So that's big, broad strokes. I know I'm not going into a lot of detail with each one of these. I could spend all day talking about each one of these and relate them to the practice of law and how you're doing. But what I want to do, we only have 60 minutes. So I want to revisit this bias ecosystem again and draw that same connection between the thoughts that we have that are laden with cognitive biases, and then relate them back to the social biases, right? Gender, race, culture, and age. Now, these 4 social biases come up a lot in diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging circles. There's a lot of movement right now to be and create a more just society and just workplace. And these issues need to be tackled. But if they're tackled transactionally, you're increasing the probability that they're just going to go poorly. Social biases and the impact of social biases are best held in a heartfelt conversation. And the 2 people that I've teed up to really unpack social biases are going to treat them as such and talk specifically about how those biases have impacted them in their practice and in their profession as lawyers. So we are truly, truly, truly fortunate to have our first lawyer as part of this panel in Sejal Thakkar. And Sejal, if you'd take yourself off, beautiful, there you are. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Sejal has an incredible practice called TrainXtra and works with businesses to help them understand and deepen their understanding about harassment, discrimination, compliance courses. She and I are collaborating on some projects. I'm going to prop her up a little bit and say, look out for her in this coming year, as she's going to be doing a TEDx talk in the coming months. So Sejal, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I'm really excited to talk about this area. So I wanted to do just a quick activity with everybody first. And so, if you're comfortable doing it on a piece of paper or just typing this into chat, whichever you prefer. But what I'd like to do is I'm going to throw out a bunch of different categories. And I don't want you to think too much about it. I'm going to go kind of quick through this activity. So get your fingers, if you're going to be typing in the chat box, ready to go. But what I want you to do is, as I name off these different categories, write down the name of the first person that comes into your mind as I go through these categories. Again, there's no right or wrong answer, but you'll see where I'm going through this once we're done with the activity. So I am going to go kind of fast because I don't want you to overanalyze your answers. Just write down the first person, the name of the first person that comes into your mind, okay? All right. So the first category I would like for you to think about is genius. Who pops into your mind? And go ahead and you can put this in the chat, or you could just write these down on a piece of paper. I see a lot of Einsteins coming through, Gates. Okay. All right, good. Now, what about this next one? Astronaut. Lynn Miguel Miranda. Okay, Neil Armstrong. Armstrong, a lot of Armstrongs coming in. As I expected, sure. What about this next one? Teacher. Who do you think of?
Mm.
Miles, Hawking. CEO. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates. Politician. Politician. Here we go. Obama, Joe Biden, use some Trump. Okay. And the last category is basketball star. Yes, Jordan. Thank you, Anna. My favorite, LeBron, Steph Curry. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I want you to take a look at the names and the categories that you've put down. Think about, what if I asked you to go back to those same categories and I asked you to think about somebody from a different demographic? Would you be able to do it? I mean, would it be more difficult? Would you find it more challenging? What we typically see, and the reason why I like doing this activity is, for example, if we're talking about genius or astronaut, and I've done this activity many times in a lot of my trainings, typically people are going to, put Einstein down for a genius, Armstrong, we saw that happening here in the chat, or some other white male, but we don't see a lot of females in there. We don't, unless I go to, the only one I really get people of color popping up is sometimes under basketball star, right? And so these are what we call stereotypes. And I'm going to go through some definitions with you in a second. But I want you to just think about, when some of these stereotypes, and I'm really going to be speaking to you about gender and race right now, but they're so deeply ingrained in our cultures that they're hard to pick up on. And so when you do activities like this, and I'm going to show Matthew, if we can show the PowerPoint slide, one of the gender stereotypes that I've dealt with over and over again in my career is this one. You don't look like a lawyer. I mean, when I think back to my career, I can think of at least 30 times when somebody has made this statement to me saying that I didn't look like a lawyer. In fact, several of these times were actually in court. I mean, when I first started litigating cases, I was actually doing workers' compensation at the very beginning. And I recall at least 3 situations. Now, this is back, I got licensed in 2003. So from 2003 to about 2005, I was doing workers' compensation hearings. And oftentimes I was the only female in the room, and definitely the only female of color. Right. And I remember this one case I was working on when the judge, it was a trial, and most of these cases often, settle. We don't even get to trial. But this one did get to trial, and the room was filled. And these are administrative courtrooms. And I was sitting there ready to go. And the judge walked in, a white male judge walked in and said, "Okay, let us know when the lawyer's here and we're ready to go." And I looked at the judge, I go, "Your Honor, we're ready to proceed." Right. I mean, that's embarrassing. It made me feel like I was invisible and that my work didn't matter. And so you don't look like a lawyer. This is not something that is just stuck in the legal profession. We hear this with doctors, CEOs. You don't look like a CEO. You don't look like a congresswoman. You don't look like a scientist. You don't look like a professor, right? So what this highlights for us is the consequences of the past, the racial and gender discrimination, as well as the racial and gender divisions that we're dealing with right now, create significant barriers for people of color, Black people, and genders to really get quality access to resources and to be able to do their jobs. There was a study that was done by the National Association for Law Placement in 2019, where they looked at 232 law firms, and they found that women of color were only 8.5%. 8.5%, and Black women were only 1.73, less than 2% of all the attorneys that were surveyed. So law firms are overwhelmingly white and continue to be male dominated, right? And I wanted to give you a recommendation for a book. If you're interested in learning more about this, you don't look like a lawyer stereotype or mentality that is prevalent in the legal profession. There's a book that was written by the author's name is Cedal Malaku, a sociologist from University of New York. And she wrote this book called You Don't Look Like a Lawyer. And it really explores in depth systemic gendered racism in the legal profession. She interviewed Black female attorneys at elite law firms and came out with this book. And the findings in there are just, when I read some of these findings, I was thinking, wow, I can't believe that we are still dealing with this, but we're going to talk a little bit deeper, and I'll give you some of those statistics as we go on. So let's look at some definitions really quick so we all get on the same page. The first one I want to talk about is, what is a stereotype? Stereotypes, and that was the reason why I had us go through that activity, are just simply overly generalized beliefs about a particular group of people, right? So when I said astronaut, we saw the same sort of names popping up of the same sort of demographic, right? So that's what we're talking about, stereotype. Now, gender are social roles. These are behaviors, attributes, responsibilities assigned, established, or taught based on the basis of sex, right? Whether you're a male or female. And then gender stereotypes are overly generalized beliefs about the nature of men, the nature of women. And it really goes into their core characteristics, their strengths, their weaknesses, and natural predispositions to certain roles or responsibilities. So I looked at this study by the US National Judicial Education Program, and it was very interesting because when they talk about gender stereotypes, they came out with three themes that we see over and over again. And I know this is going to resonate with some of you, especially the females that are here that are working in the legal profession right now. A lot of stereotype thinking about the nature and the role of women as attorneys. So, the way that women should behave in these roles and should be performing in the society. Another major theme we saw was really devaluing what we talk about as women's work, right? So, paid work, which is typically performed by men, tended to be higher, valued higher than unpaid, caretaking, for example, which is predominantly performed by women and often taken for granted. And then the third thing we saw was that there was if we look at sort of who's making the decisions, whether it's judges or attorneys, and if we don't have representation, so we don't have females, we don't have people of color, we don't have Black attorneys there, that these people that are making these decisions that are impacting all of those vulnerable characteristics of women, people of color, these people really don't have an understanding of who's being impacted by these decisions. So for example, if you have a male judge, they might not understand what it's like to be a stay-at-home mother, yet they're making decisions that are going to impact women or people of color. So I want to talk to you about sort of 4 patterns that we see on this next slide of gender bias. And again, I'm going to share the report with you that this comes from. There was a report that was done by the American Bar Association Commission on Women in the Profession, as well as the Minority Corporate Counsel Association. Great report. We're going to put the executive summary, the link in the chat box for you. But you really should take a look at this if you're interested in learning more about these patterns. But really, they talk about it in these 4 categories. Prove it again bias. And this is really talking about, the need for women and people of color to work harder to prove themselves, whether it means you got to work longer hours, you got to work over the weekends, you got to work harder to get noticed. And you have this pressure of being perfect, of being flawless, because you're already working against a stereotype assumption being made about you of some level of incompetence. Because you're a woman, because if you're a person of color, you're incompetent. So now you have to prove yourself. Research, and you'll see this in the report, they talk about women of color and just women in general significantly being penalized for marginal errors as compared to their counterparts of white men. Also, women of color said they were being held to higher standards than their colleagues, right? So this puts a lot of pressure on women and people of color. Now, the tightrope bias is an interesting one because, again, this goes back to feeling pressure to behave a certain way. So there's this narrow range of behavior that's expected that to be appropriate for a woman or a person of color. And so if you're not acting feminine or you're not acting in this tightrope sort of areas that are defined by our culture and our societies, then you're going to receive backlash. So for example, if you are aggressive as an attorney, you might not be liked by the people that you work with. I mean, I personally went through that when I was litigating cases in court. And obviously I'm working hard and I had to prove myself even more because I had this sort of bias against me already. And the other one that was interesting too, and the statistics, again, mind blowing, that women and people of color had to deal with a lot more loads of work that was sort of office housework, taking the notes, ordering lunch. And I'll share with you statistics on the next slide. Maternal wall bias, this is well documented against women. Women of all races reported that they were treated worse after they had children. They were passed over for promotions, received lower quality assignments, demoted, paid less after they had kids, and unfairly disadvantaged at work. A lot of them also said that there was this double standard. And even men reported this part of that double standard where they said that there wasn't as much flexibility for people once they had a child to take time off of work, or taking any kind of if they did take some kind of time off, that it negatively impacted their careers. And then the last one that the report talks about is the tug of war bias. That's within the members of disadvantaged groups now, turning on each other or fighting for that one seat at the table because there aren't enough spaces at the table. And I'll tell you, as a woman, and especially of a color, as I started getting into the higher positions at the law firms I worked at, the competition got, it was cutthroat. It was cutthroat. And you hardly saw women of color in these positions. And if you did, you were still competing against them because there just weren't enough seats there. And so you found yourself in these situations. And so with the report on this next slide, I just picked out some statistics that really resonated with me. But I really want to highlight that what the report really showed was that in the legal profession on all levels, you know, there was bias that was impacting equal opportunities from getting hired, receiving fair performance evaluations, being mentored, receiving high quality assignments, networking opportunities, getting paid fairly, getting promoted. I mean, all levels, there was bias that was there. And as a trend throughout the report, it showed women of color were receiving the highest levels of bias. So here are just a few statistics that jumped out at me as I was reading this report. 58% of women attorneys of color and 50% of white women lawyers said they were mistaken for administrative staff or as janitors. 63% said that they had to go above and beyond, like I said, you know, having to prove themselves to get the same kind of recognition as their colleagues were. Women of color, you know, experienced prove it again bias at a higher percentage than any other group. 67% women of color reported being held to higher standards, and 70% said women of color said they were paid significantly less than their counterparts with similar experience and seniority. I mean, when I read statistics like this, we have to ask ourselves some tough questions, you know, questions about why are we not addressing these issues, you know? And so I wrote down just 3 questions that I really, really want everybody to kind of think about when you look at your law firms and you're in the environments that you're working in. Why are we seeing not as many women or people of color? Why is that so rare, especially when we're looking at the partner level? Ask yourself why the attrition rates of women and people of color are so high, and why are they being advanced at such a low rate? Ask yourselves these questions about, and that book does a really good job at highlighting this. Why are Black female associates hired in greater numbers than Black male associates, but not promoted to higher positions? We need to ask these tough questions. The evidence is right there in front of us, and we need to talk about this. And so as Matt's going to talk about a little bit later on in the presentation, that there are things that we can do, that we can implement, that we can measure to our existing work systems to interrupt these from continuing forward. So Matt, I'll turn it back over to you to kind of move us on with this presentation.
Sejal, I had one quick question. Is prove it again similar to when the assumption is made that people of color or females somehow got ahead through affirmative action?
That could be a part of it. That could be a part of it. I think some people do think that, oh, you must have gotten there because, you know, you are the token or you're got through and through the affirmative action that was referenced in the report as well. Great question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Josh, in that it's an example of affirmative action is an example of an institutionalized bias, right? Sometimes we have to change laws in order to change society. And when you look at this bias ecosystem, one of the things I think is so useful about it is that you can start to differentiate, you know, where is the source of this coming from? And here in our country, in our legal system, we have a long history that we're sort of up against to produce any type of systemic change. It's not going to happen overnight because we didn't get here overnight. And one of the things I wanted to just highlight when Sejal picked this image, I just loved it, because if you'll notice, the shadow in the background is how unconscious bias works. Even if I see Kamala Harris coming at me down the road, badass pose in all, a part of my brain still sees her as a girl, a little, you know, in a feminine way. And all of the associations that we have around what it means to be feminine, right? That is what our brains struggle against and is a source of a lot of these things, that the specific types of gender bias that Sejal was shedding some light on. And remember, it's those behaviors over time that become codified in our processes, in our regulations, in our institutions, and how we So I'm going to fast forward back down here, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Randy Choi. Randy is a partner in a firm. He's active with jams. He had a fan club here already. Randy is an amazing attorney, and he's going to take the next 10, 15 minutes or so and really unpack cultural bias as it relates to the practice of law and that fourth titan of social bias, age, and often overlooked age. So thank you, Randy, for being here. Take it away.
Thanks. Thank you, Matt. I hope I can let somebody know, or let me know if people can't hear me. Thanks for that great intro. And just talking about affirmative action, I went to college and law school during the time of the Bakke case and followed up later on with the Croson studies. So this whole idea of affirmative action as part of the bias thing is an incredibly interesting area, and I'd love to talk about it at some other time with anyone who's interested. My little piece of this, I'm going to talk about going from the general to the specific, because I'm sure as lawyers, all of us have been targets of bias, or perhaps beneficiaries of bias. It's kind of hard sometimes, I think, to figure out whether the use of bias or the issue of bias is helping or hurting us. So my first topic is using cultural bias as a shield. Picture this, and this happened quite a long time ago, but this was a true story. 40 years ago, when I first started appearing in the trial department in San Francisco, there were probably one or two, or at most three persons of color in the 100 or so people appearing in trial court. Any attorney who's litigated knows that sometimes you're not quite ready for trial and you have to ask for a continuance on the day of trial. Maybe a witness doesn't show up, who knows? On this particular day, a person of color, I will say he was Chinese because that will make more sense here when we do the presentation. But when when his case was called, he stood up, and I knew the gentleman. He stood up and, actually breaking a stereotype, strutted to the front of the courtroom, right in front of the dais, and started and asked for a continuance. It was early February, about the time of Chinese New Year, and it became very clear that he was not prepared for his case. So what he did, and he said something like this. He said, "Your Honor, on this auspicious day, a week before the beginning of the Chinese New Year, I must ask for a continuance." And in fact, it would be a travesty to start a trial on this auspicious day, an insult to 5,000 years of Chinese history. Now I'm sitting there as a young attorney going, boy, this is quite a bit of grandstanding, and it in fact made me a little embarrassed because I figured you ought to be prepared when you got to trial. Nonetheless, the effect of this was actually quite profound when I think about it, because he was using it as a shield to protect protect his client's interests, in that he actually wasn't ready for trial. Now, what effect did that have on the judge? As I was preparing these comments, I was thinking that the cultural bias as a shield and the cultural bias as a sword is intertwined. It's pretty difficult to figure out if there's one or the other. So in this case, it acted as a shield to protect the attorney's client. But how did it affect the judge who was sitting up there on the dais? Some judges might be incensed. Most judges, especially in San Francisco, and this one, was not necessarily intimidated, but was probably found the situation humorous. But he also realized that if he started asking the rather typical questions to establish the the validity, the good cause of getting a continuance, he might be perceived as being racist or culturally biased. So in a sense, it was a shield as well as a sword in this case. Obviously, that was just Chinese New Year, but one could easily extrapolate that for another holiday, such as Cinco de Mayo or Kwanzaa or any other of those different cultures or holidays from different cultures. Now, I'm not endorsing any of the examples that I'm giving you. That will be left to the individual attorney as to what is ethical and what is zealous representation. Just to be aware of the situation is my point. In terms of depositions and in trials, constant cultural references come up. Sejal talked about stereotypes. A lot of times, attorneys can use stereotypes to their benefit. I can't tell you how many times I've heard an attorney with a client in an Asian culture say, "Hey, I gotta tell you that question doesn't make any sense culturally, and I'm not allowing you to answer that question," or something to the effect of, "Chinese people don't answer those kind of questions," or Japanese people don't answer those kinds of questions. So again, is that a shield? Is that a sword? You can imagine the look on the opposing counsel's face when presented with the task of trying to ask a question that is culturally sensitive, but of course necessary for the case. I'm trying to move along here quickly because I know this time has really gone really quickly. One of the things that we use, especially as a mediator, I appreciate, is when you're using it as a shield or you're using it as a sword, it doesn't hurt to be self-deprecating. It doesn't hurt to have a little humor. If you are in one of my mediations, you might hear me say, you know, that might not be the best position to take in this case. 5,000 years of Chinese history tells me that that's not a good move in negotiation. Now, I got to tell you, as a fourth generation San Franciscan and American, my ties to Chinese culture are probably not particularly strong, although I do speak Chinese and I do have some cultural references. But the idea of being self-deprecating and not being terribly sensitive, a chip on the shoulder, so to speak, is a good way to present biases in a beneficial way. Something I thought about last night was that language accentuates bias, both good and bad. For example, in a deposition, if the attorney and the client are conversing in Chinese, that automatically presents sort of a united effort because the opposing counsel realizes that the attorney actually does understand the culture, does understand where the client is coming from, and that acts as a bulwark in terms of presenting a good, credible case. Does that make the attorney uncomfortable? Certainly, I'm not insinuating that you should use language to thwart the rules. You should not be coaching your client, but merely something, again, to be aware of in terms of the cultural references. Attorney, be aware that the response of the opposing counsel can be twofold. It can again be somewhat deferential to the minority client. It can also create the opposite effect and be extremely hostile. I would say we live in a bubble in here in the Bay Area, so it's probably more to be deferential, but it could be either. The whole idea of a bubble, again, be aware that we are in a bubble. I had a deposition a couple of years ago where we had a bunch of Bay Area attorneys, but we also had someone from the Midwest. I happened to be the one taking the lead in the questioning, and after about 2.5 hours of questioning, we took a break, and one of the the Midwestern attorney, just trying to be friendly, turned to me and said, so Randy, where are you from originally? Are you from Hong Kong? And one of the other attorneys just gave out a huge horse laugh and kind of berated him and said, well, just listen to his English. Do you think he was born in Hong Kong? And actually, when you think about that, that raises all kinds of issues of your stereotypes, your cultural biases. Again, I was not offended. I thought it was pretty funny, but it raises the idea of what preconceived notions people have, and just being in a different part of this same country has quite an effect. A story on a similar note is there was a very large law firm, one with these 60-foot conference rooms that hold 50 people, and they wanted the mediation to be held in their office so that they could have an advantage. And just to show that even these location bias, proximity bias, and the bias between city attorneys and small town attorneys is prevalent, or is pretty common here as well, because the other attorney in this case was from the Central Valley, a small town, and could easily have been a victim of this city attorney, small town attorney bias. Fortunately, he was a pretty competent individual, and I won't use the words he used, but he basically said, don't even think that I'm going to be taken advantage of by these big city attorneys. So again, even in our bubble, there are many, many ways to experience the bias. I'm looking at the clock here, and we're already at 1 o'clock. So let me move on to age. You know, on the sports, in the sports arena, age is not a good thing. As an amateur tennis player, and at my tender age of 67, I realize I am just not as fast, not as skilled, not even as competitive or energetic on the tennis court. In the legal field, however, I would think that age and experience would be something beneficial. Again, age and culture play a role here. In many cultures, Asian in particular, age is a good thing. Age is revered. Age comes with it experience and generally respect. In American culture, I'm not quite sure that that's exactly true. The idea of an older person not having the energy, not having the competitiveness, not having the drive, I think is a little more prevalent in American culture. Just take a look at our president-elect. One of the biggest criticisms that I've heard, and of course on the media as well as personally, is that he's just a little bit too old. And of course the ticket had to be balanced. Of course, it's great that our Kamala Harris is vice president-elect, but I'm sure a lot of it had to do with her age as well to balance out President-elect Biden. So there's definitely that issue. As a mediator, what we try to do is, whatever our age, keep up the level of energy and enthusiasm, and try to keep that age criticism or bias as keep that at bay so that we can work with people of all ages. Something that I'm finally being able to do, having gotten more gray hairs and less hair and all of that, all the indicia of age, and combining it with culture, is to occasionally use the hat of I'm the old wise Chinaman. Of course, using that term would normally be a pejorative, except when you are, and truth being a defense. Again, a little attempt at humor. But it generally breaks the ice, and it keeps things going. So you can use cultural bias in many, many different ways. I would suggest, again, mostly wearing a mediator hat, that you take it seriously, that you can use them as tools, use them ethically, but take them with a grain of salt, because as Matt has said, and I learn something every time I work with him or listen to him speak. And of course, Sejal was really helpful today too. Everybody has biases. There's nothing we can do about them. Just recognize them and use them, and try not to abuse them. I guess in closing, since we're past 1 o'clock, it's not so bad to be the wise old Chinese guy in our profession, and use what biases you have for your benefit.
Oh, thank you, Randy. Thank you, thank you, thank you. When you shine a light on cultural biases and age biases, those two are most often the two that are overlooked of the four. I think gender and race are take up a lot of spotlight. They've gained a lot of traction, especially since 2018. Gender bias, there's tremendous movement to disrupt that, right? And much more recently, there's a lot of movement to disrupt racial bias, both in and out of the workplace. And too often our brains just whittle things down to binary constructs, and we just think of them in this or that, one or the other, right? Racial bias is only black or white, when it's so much more than that, as you're attesting. And when you start to look through it through a lens of cultural bias, now we have all these different areas that come into play. It's not just about race. It's not just about gender. It's also about culture and age. And so I can't thank you enough for just sharing some of your personal stories and then tying that into the practice of law. We are now past the top of the hour. I do have a couple closing slides that I can go to, but before I do that, I'd like to just stop the screen share and then see if there's anything that came up for any of the attendees in the Zoom room. If you can, put that into the chat. If there's a question, a comment, a concern. I did see Maria was shining some light on the link that Shanti shared. So if there's anything else that you'd like to hear from us, if there's any questions or something resonated or didn't resonate or needs to be clarified, I want to just carve a little space for that right now. And if that isn't prompting, if nothing is coming in, I'll leave you with a couple notes. So I'm not seeing anything come into the chat. I don't see anything in the Q&A. I'm going to go back to hijacking your screen and we will close this out. So a couple of things to bear in mind. When we're in a pandemic, there's a lot of bias amplification that's happening. It's all over the place. Two of the unconscious biases that are being inflamed in a pandemic are normalcy bias, which is defined as our unconscious desire, and often it's a conscious desire, but a yearning to return to what is normal, right? And you hear it come out in all different ways. Back to normal as soon as the vaccine happens, after the first of the year, blah, blah, blah. Nothing has changed. Our numbers are still going up in this country. So normalcy bias is contributing to that rise in numbers, because there is this sense of wanting to return to what is normal, rather than embracing a new normal and what we have to live with and work with right now. Confirmation bias is another one that's amplified, especially in the news. And you can hear signs of that. Confirmation bias is when you have a preconceived idea and you just fill it in with available information, right? Often it's readily accessible. Sometimes it's sought after, but it's just validating a preconceived idea. And confirmation bias is implicit in headlines. It's implicit, it's part of the seeds of political division and discourse. And it's something that you just, that I'm calling attention to so you can be more mindful of it and aware of it and not just accept it and allow it to be internalized. Because it's the internalization of these cognitive biases that result in the stereotypes that Randy was alluding to. And a stereotype is not in and of itself, a stereotype is an incomplete story, right? Stereotypes are not wrong because they're true. Stereotypes are wrong because they're incomplete. They only present a snapshot of a person. And I think that that comes from one of the sources of that is the way our brains process information. These cognitive biases that I'm showing you on the screen here all have blind spots associated with them. They all have fractures in our thinking that are associated with them. Like me bias, for example, played out over time through behaviors, you end up with people that are all similar in their thinking. You end up with groupthink. You end up with an echo chamber, right? Does that sound familiar? That's how it plays out in the bias ecosystem. Egocentric bias, you end up being intimidating, right? If you're presenting yourself as the sage on the stage, right? You end up intimidating other people, and maybe that's intentional, but over time, that behavior can translate directly to a loss of creativity and ideas and personnel from firms, from organization, a brain drain, a talent drain. Availability bias is one that's, where I mentioned decisions are made on just the readily accessible information. Confirmation bias is a type of availability bias. And one of the drivers of that is just valuing quantity and expediency over quality. And we're all subject to that because we all live by deadlines and have very busy schedules. Availability bias is very prevalent and happening all the time. Anchoring bias, this is very intentional use, especially by attorneys, right? You want to anchor the mind of a jury on your position, right? The rightness of your position. We use anchoring bias all the time in sales, in marketing, right? It's the genesis behind retail sales, where you have a number that's slashed in half, and so you automatically think you're getting a better deal, right? Anchoring bias is getting your mind hooked, anchored on that initial graph or data point or precedent, right? And how that translates over time, right? By repeated exposure to those images, it becomes a basis for stereotypes, right? And those norms become internalized over time through behaviors. And then finally, proximity bias. I gave some examples of that earlier, but we need to really remain steadfast in the illusion of proximity right now is actually more productive than being in person. Holistically, we need to, keep and maintain healthy practices right now because we're still in a pandemic. The last thing I'll end on is that preposition, in a pandemic, has been so useful because it relieves a certain amount of cognitive dissonance. Part of our struggle right now is because there is so much uncertainty. We don't know where to go. You don't know if you go to the grocery store, if the person ahead of you had COVID or not. Like, there's just this sense of uncertainty all the time in a pandemic. But when you add in a pandemic onto things, it just makes it easier to deal with the complexity, right? And everything is complex in a pandemic. You can't shake hands. You can't do all the things that we normally did. You can't meet people. You can't go to Christmas gatherings. You can't be with family. You got to think through all of these things in a pandemic, and that is our new norm. So adding in a pandemic has been a real source of cognitive ease because it's a certainty. We are in a pandemic. And so by default, it does relieve some of the uncertainty when you weave that into your discourse and language. And with that, Joshua, I will stop sharing the screen. Josh, I'll ask you to come back on. Anne, there you are. Joshua, Anne, if you have any questions for us, happy to grab those. If you have some final thoughts or parting words for your constituents.
No, the chat is full of praise for the program, and I share. Yes, so thank you. A great program, very enlightening. I would just ask everyone to fill out your evaluations so that that's hugely helpful both to the panelists and to the Bar Association and the Lit section. Thank you to Randall and Sejal and Matthew for doing this program. The time just flew by because the topic was so interesting and because your presentation was awesome. So thank you very much.
Yes, my sentiments exactly. Thank you very much for your time and effort. I know we really appreciate it, and it was educational and fascinating as I expected. It was awesome. Thank you very much for all of that. So if nobody has any questions, we'll depart from here today, and hope everybody has a nice afternoon. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.